So Shabbat Shalom again. Shabbat Shalom. Of all the characters in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, perhaps you did not know that only one of them has been historically validated outside of the biblical text in some way. That's not meaning in the books of the prophets or in the books of writings, ketuvim, but in the books of Torah. It's old stuff. Historicity is hard to prove. But there is proof of one. In 1967, archaeologists uncovered an inscription on the wall of an ancient pagan temple in the area of Transjordan that mentioned this singular biblical character in remarkably similar terms to how he is portrayed in the Torah narrative itself. Want to guess the character? That was more of like I don't want you to say, no, I don't want to guess. I want you to guess. I realize I phrased that in a way that sort of set it up for that. Anyone have a guess? Moses, right? That might seem like we would like that. Joseph, also, that would be awesome. Nah. Saul also would be awesome. He's not in the 5 books of Moses, but close. You can keep guessing, but I'm going to just give it away because we could sit in this for 10 minutes and that would take up my time. So the person who is named is a seer named Bilam ben Peor. One of, if not, the most important characters in our Torah about whom you've probably never heard. And interestingly enough, when it comes to something or someone we might consider significant from our most ancient Jewish stories, in more ways than one, Bilam stands alone. You see, Bilam sits at the center of this week's Torah portion, toward the end of the book of Numbers, in one of the strangest and seemingly cartoonish narratives we have. The evil foreign king Balak is terrified of the Israelite nation. To protect himself and his people, he enlists the services of a renowned sorcerer for hire, Bilam. And he hires him to curse the Israelites. While en route to the Israelite camp, God sends an angel with a fiery sword to help Bilam, to stop Bilam, but Bilam cannot see this angel, but his donkey can. And the donkey tries 3 times to stop Bilam short of walking into this angel and being killed. But all 3 times that the donkey stops, Bilam beats his donkey for what he perceives to be its idiotic disobedience. At which point, and here's where it gets cartoonish, the donkey turns to Bilam and says, "I've served you loyally all my life. I've never betrayed you. Do you really think I would do something to upset you if it wasn't to protect you?" And then the text reads that God opens Bilam's eyes so he can now see the angel himself. With the proverbial writing on the wall, Bilam understands the error of his ways, and instead of cursing the Israelites, blessings come forth from his mouth instead. There are a few reasons I think the story, and in particular Bilam, likely aren't so familiar. One, it seems like just another story of a foiled plot of an evil king to destroy us. We've had a lot of those stories already, so what's the real impact of another one? 2, it has a talking donkey. So how seriously can we really take that story anyway? And 3, Bilam ultimately isn't even the true antagonist. He's just a middleman. It's Balak, the evil king, with whom we should be most concerned, right? Wrong. From early on, Jewish tradition understood Bilam's power and significance So much so that the rabbis of the Talmud actually said Balaam was a more powerful prophet than Moses. Noting the Torah's final words that there has never arisen a prophet in Israel more powerful than Moses, the Talmudic rabbis then added an exception. But among all the nations, there was one. And who was he? None other than Balaam, whose talents surpassed even Moses. Balaam might have had unsurpassed talents, but nevertheless, Jewish tradition ultimately vilified him, declaring in the Mishnah that Balaam would have no share in the world to come, meaning his existence would ultimately be of no consequence at all. So the question is why? Didn't Balaam change his ways? Didn't he bless the Israelites? What flaw could have possibly accounted for his ultimate degradation in the eyes of our tradition? And I'd like to elevate one primary answer for us tonight, one that the Talmud says was ingrained in the core of his identity, rooted literally in his name, because translated into English, Balaam means belo am, one without a people. As Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory taught, Balaam was a prophet for hire. He had supernatural powers. He could bless someone and that person would succeed. He could curse and that person would be blighted by misfortune. But there was no hint in any of the reports, biblical or otherwise, that Balaam was a prophet in the moral sense, that he was concerned with justice, mercy, the rights and wrongs of those whose lives he affected. Like a contract killer of a later age, Balaam was a loner. His services could be bought. He had skills, and he used them to devastating effect. But he had no commitments, no loyalties, no rootedness in humanity. He was a man without a people. And ultimately, Balaam didn't even trust or care about the one creature that cared for him unconditionally. He was truly in it only for himself. Contrast this now to Moses, who lived his life not only with, but for the people. Even when he was completely fed up, even when they turned their backs on him, Moses never turned his back on them. In fact, when God was willing to abandon the entire Jewish people and just continue on with Moses alone, Moses refused to take the deal. He wasn't blind to the flaws of his people or his nation, and he stood up for justice when it was necessary. But he balanced that with a call for mercy, and most importantly, he strove to never make his service about himself, leading with humility. It's interesting to consider that unlike Balaam, we do not have any archaeological evidence of Moses in the ancient Near East outside the biblical text itself. Balaam's name is on the wall. It's written, but not the name of Moses. And I think that's a fitting metaphor for the tension between the two forces that each person represents still in our world today. So much of our world and our lives are governed by the forces that governed Balaam. The pull of self-interest, of entitlement, the erosion of the importance of community, the devaluation of real connection, the kind that demands the subjugation of the self in place of the elevation for someone else. That you do you and I'll do me attitude. It's all Balaam. And for all the perceived power that these forces offer to free us from the so-called burdens of others, at the very same time, they blind us to the larger groups, communities, and people of whom we are, or at least were once, a part, and whom we, whether we recognize it or not, still very much as humans, no less Jewish people and families, need. The currents of our modern world are pushed and pulled through the forces of Bilam. They lure us into believing that we too don't need to be tethered or weighed down by loyalties to others, to our people. That our own and best self-interest should be the forces to which we give ourselves over instead. But you don't have to be a donkey to see that a choice like that is one that leads to the very same fate of Bilam himself, total inconsequence. To live a life that matters and to leave a legacy behind that endures, interestingly enough, we don't need to look to the writing on ancient walls, but rather, maybe we'd look to that writing on that wall instead. As the Israelites call out to God what they believe they need to do in order to avoid an impending exile, they promise to pray the right way, to offer the right types of sacrifices. The prophet Micah rebukes them, and he says those words, translated, "Human, God has already told you what is good and what is required. Only that you should do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God." These aspirations and qualities to live by, they don't get a lot of airtime on the walls of our social media feeds or anywhere else these days. And truth be told, they probably didn't back in Torah times either. The forces of self-interest are always loudest and luring, subjugating the moral good and best interests of the larger whole. But in the end, we should make no mistake that each of us, at every step along the way, has the choice of which force to embrace, of which current to permit to be our guide. And we should understand that being Jewish, not of being religious, but simply of making a claim on the Jewish people as one's own, demands that striving to do the good and the right thing, not just for oneself, but for the people to whom they belong and for whom they are responsible, is the only good path. I pray we'll make the right choice each and every day. Shabbat Shalom.